welcome to the second episode of season 2 of Love Dripping from the Walls. My name is Elizabeth Cunningham. I'm your host. I am here with my friend and colleague, Francisco Bujanda. Francisco has been a licensed therapist in Seattle for the past 5 years. And before that, he worked at the university level and he worked with students on meaning making. And I would love to know, a little bit more from your mouth, right from your mouth, Francisco. What do you want people to know about you? What's like the number one thing that you want people to know about you on this podcast?
I think that especially as we're talking about this particular topic that we will engage today, I think I feel for a lot of people out there right now in the context of what's been going on. And so I think wanting to be present to that and wanting to really kind of dive in deep into some of the things that are coming up for all of us. So yeah, I think if I want someone to take anything away from this conversation about who I am, it's that I'm passionate, engaged, that I want to be in people's corner. That's the only way to be, right? Especially at a time like this. But a level of consistency and congruency where, we can count on each other. So that's really what comes up.
Awesome. Well, I am really glad that you are here. I'm so glad that you
Thank you for having me.
to be on my podcast. Oh, I'm so happy
Why not?
about it. And Francisco has been working a lot. I would say that he's definitely been one of the people on the front lines for people for their mental and emotional health. A lot of people have been dealing with a lot. Uncertainty is always a hard thing for people to deal with. And especially right now where there's so much uncertainty and there's a global pandemic going on and people have lost their jobs or lost wages or, a whole host or lost loved ones or, are worried about their loved ones. Just a whole host of things are happening right now that I think one of the most important things is that congruency and that consistency that you were talking about, and really being able to stay connected and be together and really know that we are all in this together. So I also just want to say thank you for being there for people, being there for your clients, being the type of person who is that steady calm in the storm that some people are experiencing, and we're all experiencing to some degree. So
I think that's one of the powerful things right now is just noticing how people are really showing up. So many people have different things to offer, and I think for a long time we've thought of ourselves as somewhat what's the word, like frauds. We don't quite have the credentials. We don't quite have the knowledge. We don't quite have the thing.
Oh, I never experienced that.
Yeah. And the reality is it's like, we all don't need PhDs in order to lift each other up. We all don't need to be experts in our field in order to offer space. I think there's a difference between saying like, I know this, I know how to move through this, which the reality is none of us do. Right. And I think it's an invitation to really start to understand how powerful creating a space to really hear someone, to really witness someone, when you can see someone for everything they are, it's very uncomfortable. And I find that that's the saddest part about our culture, is that so many people stuck in their homes, a lot of couples are having to like look at each other and witness each other. There is no barrier. There's nothing for you to do. There's nowhere for you to go. There's no other, avoidance tactic other than fighting, and trying to project that. But what I find with couples these days is that they're just kind of like, man, I really screwed up there again, didn't I? And so there's opportunity to really take ownership. And I think that's, radically what's in question is how do we take ownership of ourselves? How do we take ownership of what we can offer? of how we can lift someone up and do it in a context where it's about us and not about someone else. It's not about what we can get, but it's about who we can be. And that's what speaks loud, how we show up. So I totally agree with what you were saying.
Wow. I mean, mic drop right there. No, it is. It's so important. I want to highlight one of the things that you said. It's how you show up and it's how you are being, and really
Really
taking
well.
ownership of how you are being. And I think that that is one of the most authentic and courageous things that you can do in life, and especially in a relationship, as we're going to be talking about couples and relationships and how people are dealing with being in the situation that they are in right now, and also just in general, because I think that one of the things that, and again, like what you said, is that there's no avoidance tactics right now. There's no like, oh well,
They try.
I gotta go to work. Oh, we'll talk about this later, or I gotta go do this thing, or remember it's this person's birthday, so we have to leave, so we need to wrap this up, or whatever. Like there is no avoidance tactics right now. This is the time to deal with your stuff, and I don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just it seems to me that it would be that it's not just that new things are coming up. There are new things that are coming up because this is a new situation that no one has ever been in before. But as far as like what's going on in the relationship, it's almost just highlighting what was already there to begin with, right? Because there is no getting out of a conversation, or so it's like if there was a problem there to begin with, it's not that it's just showing up right now. It's just now you have there's nowhere else to turn but to deal with it, right?
I mean, I would use this image too, like if you think of a snow globe, right? And the snow globe, the ones that are really full, right? They like hide the towns or whatever's inside the snow globe, right? And so I find that relationships are a little bit like that right now. Everything is so in flux. Everything's in such deep transition that it's like we've been shaken, right? We're in a state of national and global crisis. We're in a state of national and global disaster, really. And that's how a lot of us in the field are looking at this in regards to mental health. It's disaster mental health. And what do, in this time of crisis?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the image of it getting shaken up, you just see now, before you saw maybe like the tip of the iceberg, you're like, oh, I don't want to touch that. I'm going to avoid that. But now it's like, oh, it's snowing. There's nothing to cover it up. What do we do with this?
Right.
So, but you were saying in regards to that.
Oh yeah, well I mean even for myself it's hard to say the word disaster. It's like we are in a disaster. This is a pandemic. This is a global crisis. I know that people are dealing with this because I'm dealing with this. Is like, how like there's this level of when you don't know, you'll probably know more of the technical term for this, but like when something is so much bigger than you that you just can't even like wrap your head around it, know? And I think that's definitely where some of the uncertainty for people comes in, is that there is a level of denial of like how bad it is and how bad it could get if we don't take action now. Like there's this level of like kind of self-denial slash like like some full community, like there are 9 states that don't even have like a stay-at-home order right now. I have family that lives in one of those states, and I have a cousin who also lives on the West Coast, and my cousin was posting to people from my home state, and she was just like, hey, please take this seriously, please take this seriously. So I think that there's still a level of denial, and as you know, Americans, we get the privilege of that because we, you know, we're sheltered from a lot of things as Americans.
There's a lot of privilege, I think, that is coming to task at this point in time because we don't have to face some of the other realities. I mean, no one's ever on our front page who has been, who's passed away, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see pictures of people in hazmat suits, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't see the reality in other countries where, the pictures of their loved ones who are passed away that they've needed to put out into the street because they don't have the infrastructure in their country. And, because we have infrastructure, it's also a privilege of being able to say it's not that big of a deal because we don't see, right, what goes on, the grim reality, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so I just want, like, obviously we could go down that road, and that
Totally.
rabbit hole, absolutely, but I just wanted to bring that to the forefront because it is such a serious situation, and
It is.
just to have that be in one way kind of set the tone, you know, for the conversation, because we are talking about how
Totally.
relationships are going amidst this. And I think to kind of undercut it or dance around the seriousness of the situation would ultimately not serve, you know, what we're up to and what we want to create and how we ultimately want to serve people. And that is going all the way back to the conversation about being authentic and being honest, and you know, getting to say who you get to be in the situation. You can't authentically stand in who you get to be in a situation that you aren't fully transparent about,
Yeah.
right? If
Hmm.
you're lying to yourself about something, or if you're avoiding something, that stance of who you get to be amidst it's not as powerful as it could be, right?
I think we also have to be careful because, a lot of these events are super triggering, and part of what you're saying is like we're engaging, these different aspects of, our relational brain, right? Which is where our amygdala is. And our amygdala really is that fire alarm that goes off when it says something's wrong, right? But if we're if our amygdala is going off, it means our survival response is also kind of like kicking up. And if our survival response is on, it means that our ability to, use logic, deductive reasoning, decision making, any of that stuff, that's all part of what, we call our prefrontal cortex or executive functioning, is unavailable. So imagine we're like overwhelmed, which is the term that you were looking for earlier. We feel overwhelmed and we're like, okay, what the heck do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And then people are around me saying like, observe this time, use it, it's an opportunity. And if this is your first rodeo, insofar as like feeling overwhelmed and not knowing how to manage that, because the emotional regulation skills around that type of intense emotion is not there, then it's really hard, and there's a lot of shame and guilt that gets wrapped up into feeling like I'm not doing what I can. And this is actually where the stigma of mental health comes from,
Mm-hmm.
because people don't see that if a person's going through a hard time, if they are, experiencing situational depression or even major depression or any other number, right,
Mm-hmm.
of significant mental health needs, it's stigmatized because it's like you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? That's the national anthem. And the reality is that's a hot mess that we need to throw away, right? This is not pull yourself by your bootstrap, right? And one of the things that I would also say is like, even though there's a beauty about resiliency, and there's so much in the field of positive psychology as to how resiliency is really helps us build a fruitful life. This is also a time where we have to be in major transition, right? It's like growth. It's a time of growth. And we call that in the field post-traumatic growth, because this is traumatic for everybody at different varying degrees. And so if our survival response is going up, we have a limited amount of ways to handle it. We first need to find our ways to calm down, find neutral, find center, right? With our loved ones or alone. And in that context, then we could slowly start planning. But we got to make sure that we don't just jump into action or tell someone else we got to jump into action. We have to say, actually the first thing to do is distress tolerance. Find a way in which you can come back to calm so that then you can build on that. But survival doesn't really let you do that, right? It takes you, it grips you. And sometimes that anxiety that a lot of people are feeling highlights that need and that survival. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That you would, in you use the word overwhelm,
Mm-hmm.
that in your overwhelm you go into that amygdala hijack where then you're not able to make those rational, just your executive functions are not where they are without that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so no, it makes absolute total sense, and where I want to, and yes, you said all of that brilliantly. I'll just leave it there. You said all of that brilliantly, and that is, where, when what we said earlier is that, you really meet people where they're at,
Yeah.
right? And so when you have been, because that was also what I was talking about, is that like, you've been working a lot lately, and took a little bit to get you on the horn, and I'm so glad that we did. And what are you seeing that people are dealing with that you want to speak to on this podcast? Like, what do you see that couples are dealing with, people in relationships are dealing with? What do you really see that people are dealing with that you really want to speak to, that you want people to either be aware of or know about?
Yeah, I think one of the things would definitely be, and you named this earlier, because you mentioned denial, which is one of the stages of grief. But
Mm-hmm.
we're really experiencing a variety of grief, right? And so that grief is kind of like trying to discern um, the means by which I make sense of the world in the now, right? And so, like some examples of that is there's things called anticipatory grief. So we're anticipating what the fallout is going to be after this whole mess is over.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's also what we would call ambiguous grief. There's an ambiguity about the situation we're in, right? That there is a death, and the death is the lives that we knew, right? It's because that's over. Like the world as we knew it before this whole thing happened, the economy the way it was before, all the things, our jobs, our loved ones, our sense of care, our sense of safety in the world. It's a little bit like 9/11, right? It's like everything's really shifted. And so we're trying to gain a sense. It's like, well, my house is still here. A lot of things are still the same, but like I'm living in a very different age, and it kind of happened overnight. And
Yeah.
so, that ambiguous grief, that ambiguity of the whole situation really leads in. And that's not even to mention the real like baseline grief that we're feeling from losing loved ones, losing friends, right? Losing jobs, like real grief around identity, around our sense of being in the world and how we made meaning out of that. And so, yeah, I'm noticing people going through significant stages of denial, of anger, of depression and sadness, and just like and they're vacillating kind of constantly, not knowing what's coming up. And there are different stages of grief that I think other authors have highlighted, which is grief has anxiety as a part of it, sometimes as its own stage, or sometimes as like something that envelops the whole process, right? Because we don't know what the future is going to look like because we're in our grief, right? And then the other stage,
And because we just don't know what the future is going to look like, especially
exactly,
now, things keep changing I mean, sometimes it's like every day. It's not even every day. It's like every hour,
yes.
things are
Mhm.
changing. Something new happens. There's a new story. There's a new, order. There's a new whatever, it is like changing super rapidly. So I completely understand and really get what you mean about the anxiety that
Totally.
comes with grief. Yeah.
It really is. And I think, one of the things that we can really learn from the context of previous, how would you say, like natural disasters, There were a couple of natural disasters abroad where they did long-term longitudinal studies. And what they did was they checked in with these folks who had been different natural disasters abroad while on holiday, right? And this was years ago. But what they did is that they noticed, they said, okay, they asked the locals, they interviewed the locals, and also interviewed the people who were there on holiday, right, on vacation. And then they followed up with those folks about 6 months to a year later. And one of the things that they found during that time was that the people who lived, who were locals in that community that was deeply affected by, let's say, a tsunami, right? What they found out is that those people had no signs of PTSD. And even though they had signs of PTSD equally to those there on holiday when they first started the study, right? But then they went and they observed the people who went back to their homes, went back to, Europe, the US, wherever home was. And what they found out was those people were still exhibiting significant symptoms of PTSD.
Wow.
And the finding was that people that were natives and or locals in those communities that were deeply impacted, those folks had to rebuild their homes. They had to bury their dead. They had to make sense of, what does my life look like now? As opposed to folks who went back to countries that were completely unimpacted, right, by that natural disaster in another country, and it was life as usual. So there was no sense of integration. And I think one of the things around this particular study that we can garner is that it's really about meaning making, right? We are together, we can make meaning, but we have to be in active conversation about what this looks like for us. We have to, and that's why I use the term post-traumatic growth, because post-traumatic growth is about saying, what is my purpose? What are my values? And how do I make sense of what's going on? And we do that collectively. We do that in the context of community. And so these communities, local communities that were impacted by these natural disasters, they got together. They were able to make sense of that. But when it's just one person, then it makes it that much more difficult. And so I find that mental health is also like that. We're often in a solitary battle, right? So many of my clients that suffer from depression or suffer from anxiety or significant issues or relationship issues that arise quite regularly because there's some deep-seated patterns. Those things don't have a healing balm necessarily because we've been so deprived of that communal connection, right? Even with all the freedoms that we had. And so isn't it fascinating that now we have all these restrictions on our freedoms, but it also brings us into closer connection with certain people. Sometimes the very people that we're trying to figure out how to live with, how to love, So yeah, just some things to take away. I think that study always rings to mind, and how we really need to be a little bit more cognizant of the fact that we can do this together. It's a both and, right? We have to do some singular work for ourselves and internal work, but part of it too is having the conversation.
Yeah. And so, because what I hear and what you're saying is, some of the things that we see happening for sure is that, and what you hear about is people really are coming together, in some, and in a lot of scenarios where it's like, okay, how can I help out? I was on, I have the Marco Polo app. And yes, and what actually on the Marco Polo app, it'll say in the like every day, it's like reach out to 3 people a day. Like Marco, even the app is like doing like a challenge, like reach out to 3 people a day. And anyway, I've been talking to my my friend on that app, and the company that she works for in Chicago is using their families' private planes to get medical supplies into hospitals in Chicago. And I even posted something yesterday like that had pictures from all over the world of people helping each other out. There's a huge, like in places that have really large Sikh communities. Sikh communities are like making and giving away food,
Yeah.
and like different restaurants. Even here in Seattle, there's a restaurant who is making food for specifically service industry, because everyone in the service industry lost their jobs because all restaurant and bars are closed, and or I should say temporarily lost their jobs, but is holding from 3 to 7 every single day. Is anybody who worked in the service industry can come and eat for free. It's a takeout, obviously, but you can come and like get food for free.
Yeah.
And so it is like a pull. I do see like the pulling together of community, but it still is, a navigating through something that we're uncertain about. And I kind of want to go a little bit deep, or scale it back a little from the community level. But that is a fascinating point that you make about the community level, and being able to process through something and go through something, and being able to I mean, it at first it didn't make sense to me, and then as you were describing it, I was like, oh well, that makes perfect sense, because you actually did the work to go through the stages of whatever it was that you needed to do and deal with in order to come out on the other
Exactly. You weren't
side.
constantly pushing it down because everybody else around you was super happy. It's like you were given permission to feel what you felt. And I think that's one of the biggest things right now. And, community, the way I look at community is also community is relationship. And so when we're talking about, folks who find themselves partnered or in constellation of relationships, right? Like, that's your network, that's your family, that's your community. And it's really important to notice, right, the means and the hows of how you go about making sense of all of this, and to do it in an intentional way. I think so many of us, so much of what we do tends to come down to, we ascribe to values, right? Just like we do with our relationships, right? This is what a relationship's supposed to look like. And we unconsciously, right, subscribe to those values. And then, when our world falls apart, i.e. like our marriage is ending, or, there was like some level of betrayal, or things just aren't working out like we thought they would in our relationship, then all of a sudden we're like, well, what's happening? I have to address this. Of course, because maybe those things that you are fighting so hard to keep might not be exactly what, you really feel like is most important in the context of a relationship. And you've never actually had the time or given yourself the time to say, hey, this is what this means, and this is how I want to live it. Right. And so it's easier to make decisions from that values-based kind of construct.
So what would be something a little bit more specific that people are dealing with that would fall into that?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, what we were kind of mentioning before, is this anxiety, right? And so when we're anxious, it's fear, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to mitigate the fear, and we're trying to control whatever we can control. So we're obsessively cleaning the house. We're telling a person that they need to fold the laundry in this particular way. We're tidying up, right? And if we find that that's not something that we do on a normal basis, then that's usually something that we tend to do in order to mitigate this overwhelming feeling, right? We try to use that to dissipate. But part of meaning making is really starting to say, okay, clean the kitchen, right? But at the end of cleaning the kitchen, once you've had an opportunity to come back to calm, how about we observe where you're at with that particular issue? Does that make sense?
No, I didn't fully follow that. So like something happens. It
So
sounded
let's say that you're dealing with the anxiety of what's going on right now.
like, okay.
And you just had a fight with your partner because, you guys have been cooped up for a while, right? So you go and you clean the kitchen, or you go and do something that allows you to feel that sense of control, right? But then we don't necessarily return to that conversation.
Gotcha.
So the goal would be there to say, like, it's okay to take a break, But remember that part of the goal for you to feel authentic and to truly start showing up into this world as you are is to have the necessary conversations, even when they feel like they're incredibly vulnerable and revealing, you know? So, but that's survival. You know, survival is a bear chasing you down in the woods, and you're trying to decide, you know, do I run away from it? Do I, you know, try to fight it? Do I play dead? Right? Or for those of us who are familiar with, you know, um, like complex PTSD, we would also add a fourth survival stance, which is called fawning, right? Or appeasing. But the idea there is that you're trying to fiddle the bear to sleep, right? We're trying to here, like, let me people please so like you could stay really happy and everything's okay, right? Like I'm going to overfunction in this particular instance. So those are four different survival strategies that we have depending on what, you know, the experiences in our life have led us to. And so trying to create one, an understanding, right? So we have to have compassion for ourselves. We're in a crisis, this makes sense. Number two, it's also identifying what are my normal coping strategies, right? Some of them being not so great. We call those maladaptive, right? So the not so great ones are like we yell, or you know, we blame other people, or we withdraw, we go silent, right? We don't engage, or we start to, you know, do other things obsessively. And so starting to notice, how do I try to escape? And again, the escape isn't the issue. Remember, it's so important for us to feel safe. And when we can come back to calm, that allows us to effectively deal with our problems. But we have to have an experience of actually dealing with them, because if not, we get too used to always running away. Yeah.
Gotcha. And I think that, yeah, that is a vital and necessary piece that you don't see happen very often. And that even if it does happen, I think that it can, you know, there's a learning curve in my experience, that there's a learning curve on when you come back to that conversation or to that instance, that you might get triggered again, and then you have to, you know, do, you know, work through that, or do, you know, have some other thing. But I think that there's also the compassion of, for yourself to, you know, that you're not like not getting it right, right? That it's just like, this is a new thing for you, this is a new thing for your partner, you know, that you, when you, and it also goes all the way back to having the wherewithal that that is what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And so and you have to have the wherewithal to know that, so that you can catch it, so that then you can give yourself the compassion so that then you can learn the strategies to have the effective, you know, interaction or living environment or relationship, or, you know, whatever that is. And yeah, and I think that you pointed to something that was really great, which was that coming back, right? That it's not all like, once you notice it, it doesn't mean that now everything's going to go well. And once you notice it and then have compassion for yourself, doesn't mean that everything's going to go well. Once you have noticed it, have compassion for yourself, and then add the skills that you've gone out and learned or tried, or, you know, discovered, doesn't still mean that it's going to go well. That you know, there might be a learning curve for things to go smoothly, and that you have to continuously give yourself compassion. And I think that is where some of the resiliency does come in, though. Absolutely. Where then the resiliency comes in, the compassion for yourself and your own learning, and your own process and your relationships to have them work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I think one thing that's important to note is that, you know, resiliency is a component of post-traumatic growth, whereas, you know, post-traumatic growth has a ton of other pieces to it, right? And resiliency is so necessary as an initial stage, but how do we want to continue to develop from it, you know, in this larger context? And here's why I say that. You know, some of what you're bringing up, it's like, oh man, how are we going to engage? You know, okay, guys, yeah, I know this stuff. This is old news. Like, what's new around the block? I've done some of this work, right? But how do we actually really meet people and meet myself where I'm at in my process. And
Mm-hmm.
part of that is getting really clear on who you are, right? In a context where you say, here are my values, here's what's important to me. So let me give you an example. If my particular value is of loving unconditionally, right? Then I can say, when I blew up at my significant other, when I said that there's no space here, when I kind of, leaned into a sense of blame, I'm not really loving unconditionally. I'm loving by condition. I'm trying to condition myself into a context where, or even, impose on someone else, and to try to get them to see my point of view and subjugate their will towards whatever it is that I feel like is most important. And the reality is that what we're trying to do is freedom. And so if I recognize that afterwards, once I've had some time to cool down, or even in the moment, if because I'm practiced,
Mm-hmm.
then I can say, like, this isn't working towards my values. This isn't working towards the type of person that I want to be in the world, that I'm trying so hard to, um, kind of like, whether it's like make right, or make myself who I want to be with the people that I love the most, then we start to take a very different approach. See, overwhelm, I think, comes in for a lot of people when we're not sticking to what we believe in. And I think part of what's being highlighted right now is because we've been handed so many measures of success, right? This is how you succeed. That's what society tells us. This is how you have a successful relationship. This is what society tells us. And so we're like, okay, I'm eating it. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. It's a little bit like we're like just synced up to the matrix, and we're not making our own decisions, right? We're just feeding this greater machine, the monolith, to keep these constructs going. But they don't help us, right? Now, when you start to actually believe in things that other people don't necessarily believe in, oh, love doesn't work that way, or this doesn't work that way. But if you're living it, then you can be the example for whatever it is that value holds, right? And I think that's something so important and so pregnant with meaning these days, is that we don't do that. We don't take the time to really identify. And I think part of your show, what I've heard you engage in, is trying to really identify, what are our values, what's meaningful, how do we make love make sense, in what seems like a topsy-turvy kind of world, right?
Yeah.
And what seems like a world that is down on a particular way of loving. No one's going to tell you who to be. And I think that's something that I'm finding a lot. Like, Francisco, who am I? This is not enough. And I'm like, people, it's really interesting, because there's this sense that values don't give me a definitive answer. And I was like, values aren't the answer. Values are actually the thing that you use to make healthy, responsible decisions, and choices, really, right?
Right.
And I love the difference between a choice and a decision, right? The choice is, I'm going to choose it because I want to choose this. I choose this, not because I was convinced to, but because I choose it.
Right.
Whereas decision is, I've, based on all the variables, this is what I decide. But what if that variable ends up not being true, right? I married this particular person because they checked off all of these things on the list. Yeah. But
Right.
what if all those things kind of go to the haywire? Does that mean the way that you loved, and that your love to them was conditional?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to realize that, but I think to a lot of people it is.
Yeah, and it is. It's so important, and it is something that I I definitely see some people doing, and it's something that I work with my clients, is what are your commitments and what are your values, and where do you stand, and like really discovering who you are in the world, so that you have a place to stand, and a place to come from. Like, you're creating your own source. For me, like, where I stand and where I come from is in unconditional love. And so whenever something's not aligning with that, because I get irritated, I get pissed off. Like, I think that some people are stupid, like, but that is not me coming from unconditional love. And so in having that central value that I have chosen for myself, you know, that I can be like, oh, okay, well, this is an opportunity for me to grow. This is
Yeah,
an opportunity for me to look at, my own values and who I say I am.
totally.
And that if I think that this person is stupid, may or may not be a politician, I don't know, just
Or
gonna throw that.
to some degree, right?
Yeah.
That's, I think we're
But
deeply into contempt, right? As opposed to the compassion.
yeah, exactly. And so, but then it really is a way for me to look at myself and look at how I view the world. And then it's a place for me to come from in making future choices, right? Because
Totally.
like, okay, having these thoughts and feelings are fine, they're valid. It's not that my thoughts and feelings aren't valid, but it's not something that I need to base my next decision and choices off of, because it's not who I say that I am.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And I think so many of us feel compelled in some ways or pressured. And so many people also feel like, wait a minute, there's no roadmap, right? Like society doesn't have a roadmap right now.
Right.
Can someone take away my, you know, power and tell me what to do? And I think
Yeah.
those are the moments where we're like, we struggle because we're so used to something very different. So it's funny, as you were sharing, one of the things that comes up is that, we have to ask the question, who am I? Right? It allows us to create healthy boundaries. I know where I end and you begin, right? And that's so important for healthy relationships. And one of the things that we might be noticing is that we're really struggling with that. Who am I? Wait a minute, like if I'm not my job that I may have just lost, or if I'm not this, these activities that I used to do, then who really am I?
Mm.
Right. And having compassion towards that question in ourselves, but also digging deep to try and figure out, like, who am I in this particular context, right? But lo and behold, it's not just about who am I in a singular context, but who am I also in the context of others, right? It's a twofold question. And sometimes we don't allow ourselves, if we do some good work, we'll probably be like, oh, I know who I am. I am this type of person. Here we go. Like, pull myself up with my bootstraps. Like, I got this, like I'm going to win. And, there's a beauty about confidence, right? And we really need that. And we need to start with our center. And that's only part of the picture, right? The other half is also learning, who am I in a context of a larger whole, right? Like we were talking about before, like, what do I do and how do I create space for my partner? How do I create space for my loved ones who are suffering, who are struggling, and not, shooing away what it is that they have to say, but really kind of opening our heart and understanding that it's not about you, right? When you listen, it's not about you when you create space for someone, it's about them. And how can we commit to that in a context of relationship? And so that's definitely one of the things that I would say to your listeners is like, how well are we listening? How well are we creating opportunities to hold space for our loved ones who are likely really struggling, ourselves included? We think ourselves really strong, but I'm going to tell you what, I've seen a lot of clients, and no one's as strong as the person who can break down and cry and say, you know what, I learned something, that my body was telling me that this particular situation that gave me a sense of overwhelm was trying to unveil for me. And now I understand, even if just a sliver more of who I am and who I can be in the context of other people. That's purpose, right? So yeah, those would be some things to dig into, I think, for some of the folks.
Yeah, and then the question that arises for me, and I think that this comes up a lot, is the holding of space for others, but also the continual self-care for yourself, right? That you're not sacrificing yourself um, for others, that you're giving to others, but that you're giving of yourself as well, where you're able to have those conversations, being vulnerable, saying what you need, giving yourself space when you need space, or asking for contribution, or being able to receive contribution from others. I think that it's an ebb and flow, so that way you can be there for others, that you can have the empathy for your partner who you're living with, or your kids, or maybe you have extended family, living at your house, or someone else, whatever your living situation is.
Yeah.
But I think that it's important to make that distinction between like self-sacrifice and like being able to truly be there, fill up your own cup so that you can be there for others. And I think that when you have that empathy and compassion for yourself, that it's ultimately easier to have that empathy and compassion for others, because when you're able to recognize your own hurt, like exactly what you were just saying, right? Where it was just, when you're able to be that courageous and vulnerable and say, look, this is some like I'm physically affected by this, I'm mentally affected by this, I'm emotionally affected by this, like I just need like an hour to just like cry. I need someone, I need to be alone, or I need someone to talk to. Like when you are able to give yourself that gift of what you need, it's like then you can be of service,
Right.
to the people who are immediately around you and beyond, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
One of the things that brings up too is just like, how do we receive? Like, I think we're so not practiced in receiving and allowing ourselves to believe that someone there is going to show up for us, right?
Mm.
I think that's the biggest thing. If I think this is a relearning of how we show up to ourselves and how we show up to each other.
Mm.
And showing up, is distinct. Like, if we're talking about in the context of attachment, then what I would say is like, healthy showing up is a person who is able to, create a sense of safety, right? That we can count on. It's consistent. And then, having the opportunity to also be seen, right? So in being seen, we're not just able to be vulnerable, but we're also able to be validated. And that validation means that a person can see us, empathize with us, and then also justify the fact that we feel the way that we feel. And
Mm.
so it allows us to ground into that reality, right?
Yeah. So say a little bit more about like, because you used the term witnessing earlier,
Yeah.
and you just used the term being seen. So say a little bit more about witnessing someone and being seen. What delve a little bit deeper into that and what that means.
Yeah. That's a really great question. I find that those things definitely overlap, but witnessing someone is the ability to see what's unseen, even to them, to truly kind of stand in awe of a person. There's a really good book out there right now. It's called Exuberance. And I just love it because it describes through the eyes of so many,
Mhm.
right? How we've lost the art of observation. And it doesn't mean that we're going to reflect back what this person has said. It's really just an opportunity for us to be like, oh my gosh, this is what's right in front of me. I
Mhm.
think there was talking about John Muir in one point in the book and how he just was so in love with sequoias. He's like, these are amazing. Sequoia trees are amazing. And that's the witnessing. It's
Yeah.
just being in awe of another person
Mhm.
and letting them capture our attention.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I'm so glad I asked you that question. I love that.
And the being seen is more around like there are realities that we live with internally, right? Struggles that we have. And we voice them sometimes, but because we're so wrapped up in our heads, we don't do a good job of listening. So to me, being seen is the same as listening, true active listening, which is the sense of emptying of self so I can receive you. If we listen to anything by Esther Perel, um, Esther has this way of saying it, when we talk about intimacy, it's into me you see,
Yes,
and
I love
so I
that.
really resonate with that, right? And
Mhm.
if your listeners haven't looked her up, she's marvelous. I would highly recommend her.
I'm gonna write
She wrote,
that way I can put them in the show notes.
yeah, um, but she wrote a book on erotic intelligence, which is really popular. And she also has a TED Talk. So, but it's this into me you see. And so that's what we're doing. Like when we validate, we're saying, oh gosh, I feel that way too. I've known a period in my life where I felt like that. And part of it too is this recognizing that's totally justified. And so now that actually helps us regulate, that helps us find calm, right? And the third thing I would say of what it's like to show up is to soothe. You know, when we talk about the love languages, right, we're talking about, the 5 love languages. Those things actually really do help us to reground. But what we often don't talk about are the 5 apology languages, which is actually written by the same guy.
5 apology languages.
Yeah. And he actually changed the name of the book and his revision of it recently. And I think it's something towards the degree of like, when an apology is not enough. I could send you the
yeah, that way I can. I just want to put all this stuff in the show notes for people so that
totally
they can have this as a resource. So that's why I'm writing it down.
And he brings up some really great points. Also, 5 ways that different people tend to apologize. But one of the things is we don't often go through the entire process, right? Love languages isn't about, oh, I'm really good at 2 of these love languages. I'm just going to give those to you, or these are the ways that I want you to give them to me.
Right.
No, it's about rounding yourself. It's saying like, I'm not good at acts of service, right? I'm not good at gift giving. If we're like, one of my favorite quotes from Thich Nhat Hanh, I have a lot. Thich Nhat Hanh is a great Buddhist monk, but he wrote really prolific writer and incredible. But in his book on anger and talking about loved ones, he's like, if you are angry at your partner, recognize that you should already have different presents in the closet for them, so that you can remember a time when you loved them so dearly that you wanted to give them the world. And that it calls upon that compassion that you had at one moment, right? And I think that's the thing, so we need to practice this at all times, even when things are good, right? As a therapist, I know that. People are like, I'm feeling great, Francisco. I'm just not going to see you anymore. I'm like, great. I'll be here when you come back. 3 weeks later, like, I've run into a wall, and I'm like, I know, come back. It's okay.
It's going to be okay.
And sometimes it's like 3 years later, I've hit a wall. It's like, I know. It's okay. Because we all do. And I'm like, I'm not the one who, carries, right, the answer. They do. But it's where they feel most at home to kind of unpack those things. And I think we can totally be that for our partners, for our loved ones, right? So I feel like I've gotten way off topic. Where was I before?
We were on, let's see, exuberance.
Oh, apology.
Yes, apology.
So apology languages, things that we don't often do are take responsibility. We don't create restitution, nor do we try to, create some level of reconciliation. And restitution is the sense that I've disrupted this, right? If I am a child, what I'm going to try to do is, if I've done something wrong, like I took away your toy, I'm going to give it back to you, right? Mm-hmm. But if I'm, not your whatnot, like, if I'm not a kid and I didn't take your toy truck, okay, I can't give it back as a form of restitution. So we practice instead those love languages to reestablish a sense of trust, right? Mm-hmm. And then reconciliation is that sense of like, how do I prove that I won't do this again? And that part of that is literally creating a sense of consistency in the construct of, in the context really, of our relationship, where you can see that things have altered and shifted. And it doesn't mean that I might not fall down from time to time, but that I'm going to be tried and true to making sure that I create something new. And then from there, we ask for forgiveness. And so there's this, there's so much, I think, that this time breeds for us to try to unpack with one another. And that's what I would invite people to do, is start unpacking. Oh my God, there's so much luggage that we're carrying. Get that shit off your back. Actually take a look. And who knows, so much of it can go to Goodwill. Let someone else carry that, Like,
right. You don't need to carry it anymore. It's not, it's actually not necessary for anyone. You don't even need to give it to anyone. It can just be gone.
Think about it this way. If we had the opportunity to travel anywhere in the world, anywhere, but they literally said, you can only have a suitcase that is, as like half the size of an overhead carrying, bin, just like tiny little thing.
It's like a purse.
Say again?
Like a purse.
Exactly. Handheld item, right? You could only have a handheld item, but you could travel for free anywhere. Tell me who wouldn't take, and you would get paid. Let's just say you would get paid royalties on being able to travel wherever the heck you wanted to. Wouldn't you want to do that? Wouldn't you want to like, and I think that's a perfect way to think about life, where it's just like, I want to be as light as possible, because guess what? I don't have to journey through this to Paris. I could just be like, oh my gosh, everything I have is on my person. Let's go to the Eiffel Tower. I'm just going to chill out here in the cafe. Isn't this lovely? It has an opportunity to free us up into a whole new way of being. And I think we're so scared. We're so scared, Elizabeth, to be in that new way of being, because we're so sure that the life that we've been living can give us the same stuff. And yet we're finding ourselves that we can't go back. We're in this place of transition, this liminal space where we literally can't go back to how it was. And so what newness do we want to create, even amidst adversity? And a little bit like the phoenix, we've got a lot of ashes. What are we going to rise from?
Thank you for listening to the first part of my conversation with Francisco, and we will be picking back up our conversation in the next episode. And I will be putting some of the resources and the show notes for this episode, and then the next episode we're going to delve a little bit deeper into actions that you can take, things that you can actually do with yourself, your partner, those people that you're living with, those people that you care about. Obviously, you don't have to be living with these people if you're not living with a partner and you are still staying connected via technology. Obviously, these are still actions that you can take. Thank you so much for listening to our conversation today. Please like and subscribe to my channel. If you love this content, please do that. There is also an opportunity to follow me on Facebook, Elizabeth Cunningham. You can follow me on Instagram at Els Cunningham, ELZ Cunningham, or Love Dripping from the Walls is also a handle on Facebook and Instagram as well. Please feel free to reach out to me. Put some comments in the comment section. Make sure that you hit that like and subscribe button. I love you all. Keep listening and keep loving.